I am Barrett Barger,
I'm Jack Sheehy.
and we are interviewing Mrs. Eileen Jaskolski for the Milwaukee Memory Project. All right. So, first question. Can you tell us on what day you were born, in what city, and in what hospital?
Yes, for sure. I was born April 21st, 1944, at the old St. Luke's, which in those days was near the Allen Bradley campus. April 21st, and at old St. Luke's.
And would you be able to tell us a little bit about your family, like
Sure.
parents, siblings?
You bet. In those days, we lived on a street near where Alverno College is now. And it was called Princeton Avenue. It was between 35th Street and 40th in there. And it's kind of a curved street. And it was more of a little bit of an affluent neighborhood in that the chief of the medical department at St. Luke's was across the street. We had a psychiatrist living next to us. I don't know how we got into that home because my dad owned a meat market on Lincoln Avenue between 12th and 13th on Lincoln. And my mom worked for him. She did not have another job outside the home. They both only had a high school degree or high school graduation. And it was a wonderful neighborhood. We knew all the neighbors. If we would do something wrong, and Mrs. Strowinski at the corner of the neighborhood saw it. By the time we got home, my mom already knew about it because she was on the phone letting her know. But it was nice because it was almost like a neighborhood family. And today it's a little bit harder because of people's schedules. We walked everywhere, walked to school, walked to kindergarten even with a friend. And it was a distance away. And then walked to Blessed Sacrament and back. We didn't have the luxury of a couple of cars. So we did a lot of walking. And I remember enjoying my childhood. I was an only child for 6 years until my sister was born. And we played outside a lot. I can remember digging holes in one section of our yard to play marbles. We stayed out until the street lights came on, and then we had to come in. It was a nice time. There was obviously no technology, and so we had to make our own fun. I remember it as being a good childhood.
So sounds like you had a very tight-knit neighborhood.
Yes, very much so. We knew everybody in the neighborhood, and everyone knew us. And you did a lot of being together during the summer. You'd be outside together. We played with, usually each of the neighbors had children similar in age to ours. And so, it was nice. It was a nice time. No cell phones. And so you go and knock on the door to see if they could come out and play. Did a lot of bike riding, very safe. I don't remember ever locking our doors. It was just a very safe time. Yeah.
All right, and just for the record, can you tell us what neighborhood you grew up in, like in which part of the city?
It was, with South Side. We always lived on the South Side, kind of southwest a little bit, off of Oklahoma, like around 35th in Oklahoma, a major bus route. It was maybe about 8 blocks away, but we took the bus to many things because, like I said, we didn't have extra cars. My dad owned a meat market on Lincoln Avenue. My mom worked there until about 1956, when my mom started getting sick, and I was 12, and my sister is 6 years younger than I am, and she was only 6 when our mom died of a brain tumor. And that certainly was a significant part of my growing up. Being only 12, I only remember a little bit of her being sick. I think sometimes you repress those memories because they were painful. And I still have difficulty when there's a phone call in the middle of the night or late at night, because that's when my dad had to call one of my mom's sisters to come and stay with us so he could go to the hospital after she had surgery. And in September of 1956, she died. So yeah, so that, I think that helped to make me a little more responsible. I felt like for my whole life, I had the responsibility of a home, and certainly responsibility for my sister. My dad was wonderful and took good care of us. And my mother had 3 sisters who never married. It actually had 4 sisters and 2 brothers. One of her sisters did get married, and she lived very near to us off of Princeton Avenue. And she would come and help with the cleaning and things. Her other 3 sisters never married. And in fact, I found a picture of them. Oh, here it is. Okay, so my mother is, let me think here, the second one on the left, and the others were her sisters who helped our dad take care of us. Because he owned the meat market, he would work late on Fridays and never on Sunday. No stores were open on Sundays in those days. And he, so we would stay at my aunt's, the 3 of them who lived together and never married. And in that house, which was near the meat market, it was the 3 of my mom's sisters, uncle, and my grandfather. And so we would spend every weekend, and if we would be sick and couldn't go to school, one of them would come over to stay with us. And it really helped my dad raise us, because, you know, a single man in those days with 2 young children, it was difficult for him. So yeah, very blessed, and that family was very, very close and very, very caring. And I don't know where we would be if we hadn't had them.
All right. So can you very briefly just, give your parents' names and their nationalities?
Yep. My mom's name was Mary Margaret Mirkowski, Mirkowski. And my father's name was Anthony Joseph Kaczmarek, Kaczmarek.
Okay, thank you. So they were both Polish?
Polish. And my their parents and the parents before them, they all were very Polish. And yeah, and so we have a lot of Polish customs that continue to this day, that they instilled in us, and they instilled in us the importance of family and religion. They were daily mass goers, and I think that helped shape the early years for my sister and I. I don't know if I mentioned, I had one sibling, a sister, Linda, who is 6 years younger than I, and it was just the 2 of us growing up. I can remember my parents being so excited that my mom was pregnant, because my mom had a hard time getting pregnant. Yeah, so I was grateful I had it too. Maybe not every minute of every day. I do remember some arguments because we shared a bedroom, and she wasn't always as neat as I am. But, yep, that's it. Mhm.
So what grade school did you attend? And, can you just describe, what your schooling was like? How did you get there? What classes did you take? And, what your favorite subject might have been?
Okay. I went to, well, first of all, I went to Manitoba kindergarten. Blessed Sacrament was at my grade school, but they didn't have a kindergarten program. And it's interesting because a friend that I still have to today, she and I met the first day of kindergarten, and we walked from our neighborhood to Manitoba as kindergarten children, past the woods, down many streets, cross many streets. And today, there'd be no way we would let a kindergarten child make that walk all that way. Blessed Sacrament had sisters, nuns, and in the beginning, they were Notre Dame sisters. And then in about 7th grade, and ironically, that was when my mom died, was when I was in 7th grade. And in fact, I have some old pictures of the habits that the sisters wore in those days. So that was grade school from 50, let me just think a minute, from for 12 years, from 1950 to 1958. I think that's about right. We had about 50 some children in each classroom in those days. One nun who was in charge of the whole group, but we had desks right next to each other. And like I said, and in fact, here's an older picture. You can kind of see that the desks were very narrow aisles because there were 50 some in each classroom. And I think we had like a couple of classrooms of each grade. So Catholic education was really important to parents in those days. Certainly not the price that you pay today, but when, relatively speaking, it was still a good amount of money. I'm trying to think if there was anything unusual in those days. One in my life, I ended up having chickenpox when we received First Holy Communion, because we received as a group in those days. And so there were 5 of us who had a separate First Holy Communion a couple of months afterwards, because when in those days, when you had measles or chickenpox, the health department put a sign on your door saying quarantine, and you couldn't go anywhere and no one could come to visit because you had that disease. And so I received First Holy Communion, but it was sometime later.
Pretty interesting to think about that they're putting that back on your door back then, and right now what's going on with COVID and everything.
Yep, kind of deja vu, except that the whole world is in quarantine during COVID. It was pretty much our family, but it was like 2 weeks that you were quarantined before you could go out again. And the health department would come and visit you when you reported it, and then come to release you again, because they didn't have the immunizations that they have today.
Yeah. What was that experience like back then? Was it scary for you, or?
I wouldn't say it was scary. It was we didn't have virtual classes. So
Yeah.
I had an easy time in school, and I remember feeling bad because I really wanted to be at school. I didn't like being away from school. But you know, you got pampered while you were home, so that wasn't a bad thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. The COVID one at my age was harder than I recall it being when I was younger. But didn't have a lot of things to do either. You had to, you know, kind of boring. But and it's funny because those are the things I remember. I don't remember a lot of things. I don't remember a lot of my mother being sick, and I would have been. I think her illness began maybe when I was around 10. And you would think that I would have a vivid memory of that. I can just remember her being sick, and I remember her going in for testing, which was definitely not like it was today. And they came home and were so excited because they were told that it wasn't a tumor, brain tumor. And she just kept getting sicker and sicker. And I remember that part. And I remember very little of her funeral, but I remember thinking, I just want everybody to stop being sad. And I think at 12, you know, you wanted your life to be like it was, and it couldn't be for quite some time. So, yeah, but it is what it is. And I feel blessed every single day because I have these times with my children and my grandchildren that she never had.
And I know you mentioned your mother. Are there any maybe good times that you want to talk about that you had with her, like fond memories?
Oh, a few of those. I mean, I can remember enjoying being around her and loving her, and her being a very loving, and people talking about what a wonderful woman she was, and how kind she was. And I remember being very happy. I remember Christmases vaguely, you know, and sometimes I wonder, do I remember it literally, or do I remember pictures of it, you know, of those times? But you know, I was pretty young, 12. My sister doesn't remember very much at all being sick. But we had a good childhood, very blessed. Yeah.
And to go back to when we were talking about the chicken pox and how you hated not being able to be in school. So you were a fan of school, right?
I was.
Are there any like favorite teachers that you had, or favorite like things to do in school?
Well, I can tell you that, gosh, I hope, well, probably the ones who I would have had are dead now, so I probably can speak freely. But the Notre Dame sisters were very harsh. Oh my goodness. They used the ruler. They really punished the boys kneeling. And maybe that's why I found it easy in school, because I was one that followed rules. So that was good. But very harsh. And that's what I remember about them. As long as you were a good student, and as long as you followed the rules, you were okay. But you can imagine with 50 some in a classroom, I mean, you had a variety of children in a variety of ways that children learned. And today they're able to accommodate a lot of that. But in those days, you know, it was one way. And I do remember an interesting one. When I was in 3rd grade, I think maybe the school nurse did eye checks, and they found out that I really needed to go and see an ophthalmologist. And so went, and I needed glasses. And I can remember walking into church and saying to my mom, I didn't even know they had statues in this church. And I think to myself, how in the heck did I survive grade school up until that point when I hardly could see the teacher, let alone what they were writing on the board. And it was a lot of blackboard stuff, but yeah, I have just certain memories. When the School Sisters of St. Joseph came, I think it was either 6th or 7th grade. They had a very different philosophy of education, and wonderful. And I had a 7th grade teacher, Sister Raphael, who was wonderful, knew my family situation, kind of took over, you know, what are you going to do now? Go straight home. Just very thoughtful and kind. Yeah. And I kept in touch with her over the years. I haven't talked or seen her in a couple of years, or maybe 5 years now, but she was my favorite.
So it sounds like she was really able to guide you through that tough time in life,
Yeah.
and really be there for you.
Exactly. Yeah, she was wonderful. And she would keep in touch with my dad. You know, I think one time I hitchhiked, and somebody told her, maybe my sister Tab, and she was like, "Are you kidding? She really let me have it. Do you know how dangerous that is?" And I'm like, yeah, you know what? It was a pretty safe time in our lives. And
yeah,
I certainly would be on any of my grandchildren's cases if they ever something like that now. But in those days, it didn't feel like there was any trouble or worry about it.
It was just normal.
Normal. Yep. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I think it's been a very succinct. That's been a very succinct topic. All right. So let's move on here. Okay. So can you tell us, you know, the kinds of things you enjoyed as a child? Like, did you have any favorite radio or TV programs? Like any toys or anything that you like to play with? Anything like that?
Sure. Okay. So first of all, toys. I had a life-size boy doll, and his name was Jimmy, and he had actual baby clothes that I used. And this was a traumatic event. My sister dropped him on his head and cracked his head open, and we ended up having to take him. They used to have doll hospitals where you could go and have them repaired. I have never forgiven her for that. I still bring it up every once in a while. He was my favorite toy for many, many years. As far as TV, we were the only family in our immediate or extended family that had the first television set. And it was a black and white, obviously.
Do you remember what model? I'm sorry. Do you remember what model?
Oh, that's a great question. I want to say like a Motorola. I don't know if that's true, honestly. Somehow that just struck me as that's what it was. But it had an outside antenna, and you had to pray that if you were having family over to watch something, that the antenna would be pointed in the right direction, or someone would have to go up on the roof and try to turn it so that we could get reception. Very limited number of TV shows. And I think they all went off the air like at 10 o'clock at night. But I do remember in 7th grade, Elvis Presley was going to be on Ed Sullivan's show. And my 7th grade teacher at the time, maybe it was 8th grade teacher, told us that we could not watch Elvis because he shook his hips. And so when our whole family was over, my uncles and aunts and cousins, when they were introducing Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan show, I had to go into the kitchen because I knew that Sister would ask the next day if any of us watched Elvis on Ed Sullivan. And think about that. Think about what's on TV today compared to not wanting us to be exposed to shaking hips in those days. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, we made our fun. We played with jacks and jump ropes and double dutch, I remember, and playing in the streets. We could play in the streets because there were so few cars coming by. Marbles, we played marbles, we played hide and seek. Yeah, that's probably about it. Some of those memories kind of fade when you're my age, but yeah, it was fond memories, that's for sure.
All right, and that leads into our next question here. So obviously the 50s saw the rise of a lot of rock and roll stars, Elvis, Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry, Little Richard, those types of people. So can you tell us, your favorite musician at the time? Like, who was the one person you would want to listen to more than any of the others?
Well, I don't remember if it was as early as Buddy Holly but I remember really enjoying the Beatles, but the crush I had was on Ricky Nelson. He had kind of a southern country western bent to his songs, and he was so darn cute, and he was the one that I had my crush on. Everybody else could have Elvis, but I had Ricky Nelson. And I liked a variety of music. I've always loved music, did a lot of singing, took accordion lessons on the south side of Milwaukee, would walk to those lessons, took them for many, many years. My teacher was Lenny King, I remember that too. And I even taught for a while. I have my old accordion downstairs on a shelf, and the kids keep saying, "Come on, Grandma, let's bring that down." And I'm like, no, I would have to practice for a while before we could do that. But yeah, I liked a variety of music. I didn't like classical music at the time, but a lot of show tunes and things like that. And in high school and in grade school, it was mostly being in the choir. But high school and college, I was in singing groups. In high school, it was chorus and triple trio. I'm sorry, chorus and glee club. And then in college, it was triple trio and choir. But yeah, Ricky Nelson was my crush.
Everybody's got to have one, right?
That's right. That's right.
So let's go a bit forward here.
Right.
What high school did you attend, and what notable memories do you recall from that time?
Okay, I went to St. Mary's Academy. It was down at the lakefront. It is no more. It's closed. It was an all-girls high school, and I even have some memorabilia from that. We wore uniforms, and in fact, here's a picture of what our uniforms looked like. Let me see if you can see. We had red ties that we had to wear on our little white blouses, and navy blue jumpers that we, of course, hated. And then when we went to church, we all had to wear beanies like this, navy blue beanies. And I saved all of those. And that was from 58 until 62. And it's interesting because I helped with our 25th and our 50th class reunion. And one of the pages that I copied to get the pictures of the girls, I must have been in home economics, because the caption on this page was "The Way to a Man's Heart." And I'm thinking, oh, okay, not today. But yes, and so high school has fond memories too. In junior year, I was class president and got to crown the Blessed Virgin. And in my junior year of high school is when we had at St. Mary's, we did have proms. But of course, it was an all-girls school. And so we would invite boys from Don Bosco High School. And I asked my eventual husband to my junior prom. And then that was my first date ever, was when I was a junior. And then he invited me to his senior prom at Don Bosco. And I have Don Bosco is no more either. It became Pianono, and then it became Thomas More. And I have a yearbook from Don Bosco from 1961, and that was when he graduated. And our yearbook. Do you still have yearbooks at
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Troubadour was ours, and this one was mine from 1962 as well. Excuse me. And it's fun to go back and look at some of those pictures of the days when, you know, we were in school and everybody wearing the same uniform, and yeah, pretty cool.
All right. So that was pretty good. That was pretty good. So, yeah. So what were some of the things, you know, you and friends did for fun, you know, in high school? Like,
yeah, it was tough because I lived so far away from St. Mary's. St. Mary's was down at the lakefront Superior, and I lived on like 35th off of Oklahoma. So there were only a couple of friends that we could get together with. I mean, you didn't ask your parents necessarily to drive you somewhere. If you were going to do something with friends, generally you would have to walk. And so it was pretty much local neighborhood stuff. Of course, there were clubs in school that you stayed after school for, and then had an experience with friends. I was not athletic, so I was not in any, I've always been a good fan, but I'm certainly not a player in grade school, high school. Dances, CYO dances, Christian youth organizations were parish dances that you would go to when you were in high school. And they were at Blessed Sacrament, had them. So that's where we would go and, you know, see a lot of our friends would be at the dances. But not a lot of after school activities or weekend activities in those days. In high school in 1960, so I graduated in 62. In 60 was when Kennedy was elected. And in fact, his election was November 9th of 1960. And I still have the newspaper from Kennedy's being elected, with Minnesota being the state that put us over the top for his election. He was the first Catholic president, and he was charismatic. Yeah, you didn't have the instant communication like we do today, and so you had to wait to hear about it either on TV or on the news. And even though I couldn't vote, I wore Kennedy buttons. I still have those buttons, Kennedy, and then you could wear this on your blouse that just said Kennedy. It was a fun time because the nation kind of pulled together. It certainly wasn't like it is today, where you have people against each other because of their political views. It was a time when, and especially since I was surrounded by Catholics and our family was all Catholic, and I went to Catholic schools. And so it was a united front in honor of John Kennedy. So I do remember that in high school. I remember staying up very late because the TVs would continue, which was unusual. Usually they were done by 10, but they were there longer, chronicling the election of Kennedy. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I just want to elaborate on that a bit further. So was that your like first real interest in politics? Like, was Kennedy the first real politician that, you know, got you into the world of politics?
Yes, absolutely. You are correct. Yeah, before that, it was kid stuff. It was 1960, so I would have been a sophomore in high school. And so that definitely was what got me interested in politics, and not even so much because I understood what their political views were, more so because of who he was and the fact that he seemed like having the same values that I did. And like I said, he was charismatic, and so you would want to watch everything that he was involved in. And the media, it was a slow media because you had to wait until the stations would get it or the newspaper would get it. Excuse me. And so it wasn't, you kind of were anticipating things more so than now. And you're right. And then my interest in politics just kind of grew after that. I was a Democrat in those days, and became even more so interested as I went into college.
All right, and that leads on to our next question too. So what college did you attend, and from what time? What did you intend to major in, and what did you end up doing once you graduated?
You bet. So Alverno College, because it was within walking distance. And I remember my tuition was $250 a semester, and I had a $50 scholarship that was renewed every year. So my father paid $200, $400 for a year's worth of college. You can't even pay $400 for books anymore in college. And I was unsure of what I wanted to major in. So I remember right before the start of school, one of the nuns called me from Alverno and said, dear, you must pick a major. And I'm like, well, I'm not quite sure if I want education or nursing. And she was the one who said, you'd be better off starting out in nursing because of the sciences that are required. And then if you change your mind and decide to go into education, it would be easier to switch, excuse me, that way than it would be to go from teaching to nursing. And so I majored in nursing and I loved it, and graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. And started at the Milwaukee Health Department, and was a district nurse, a nurse who went out. And in those days, part of our responsibilities were to deliver birth certificates to new babies. All new babies in Milwaukee had a visit from a public health nurse, and you would go in and do a baby assessment and deliver the birth certificate and make sure that all the information was correct. And as a young, kind of naive and sheltered 23-year-old, some of the homes that I went into were kind of eye-opening for me. Pretty poor, disadvantaged homes. Many had many children. There were a couple that you have a hard time finding a place to put your bag down in order to do the baby assessments. It was a good experience for me. I enjoyed public health nursing, but I then got married in 1967, and wanted, shortly after that, like about a year later, I became pregnant. About 6 months later, I became pregnant, and wanted to stay home with my children at that point, or my child. And with the health department in those days, you could not be walking the streets as a public health nurse after you were 7 months pregnant. And so I ended up becoming 2 weeks late. And so I felt like I was home for a long time before the baby was born. But I worked as a public health nurse for probably about 1.5 years. And that was it.
And
All right.
you had mentioned your husband.
Yes.
So I just wanted to go back to that quickly.
Sure.
So I know you said you'd met him junior year for the prom, but
Correct.
how did you guys like officially meet?
Well, he was the cousin of one of the girls that I went to St. Mary's with. She was a classmate, and she and her family lived right next door to Dick and his family. Being cousins, they bought homes right next to each other. And so when I would go to see her, then I would see him a lot of times. And so I asked him to prom, and that was really the first official time that we went anywhere together. And then we started dating, and the rest is history. We were married for about 50 years before he died. And yeah, it was interesting. And my friends would tease me, oh yes, you go over to see Janice. Uh-huh.
Not really Janice you're going to see.
Right. Yeah. Well, and he went to Spencerian College, which is no more. It was a business college, and in fact, I think it was established in like the 1800s, and it was on 6th and Wisconsin originally, and then it moved to Wright Street, like about 2800 and Wright, and he graduated with a degree in accounting, and then became a CPA, and he and then was very active in sports. He was quite an athlete, and I think that got my interest in sports, not to play it, but to be a fan. And my children were all athletes, and so it was either join them or be left behind, and so so I joined them. And in fact, I think I have a picture of our wedding. We were married at Blessed Sacrament, so you can see that we stayed in the same area all the time. He lived on 45th off of Morgan, which was we were like opposite, about the same distance from Blessed Sacrament. And then we ended up as college students helping chaperone some of those dances that we would go to when we were in high school. And yeah, it was like a neighborhood family, and you knew all the people that were there, and yeah, so it was fate. I think God brought us together through Janice.
Yeah, it sounds like it came pretty full circle.
It did. Yeah, it did. Very lucky. Yeah.
And we'll take a break after this, but I just want to get this for the record. Like, is there any particular date with Richard that you remember?
Oh, I remember my prom, because he always said that was what made him continue to ask me to go out. He didn't pay much attention to me before that. I mean, I'd go there to see him and be with Janice, but he didn't care. I mean, he would be polite and nice, but then when we had our first date, then he said that's what did it for him. So it was the prom. It was our junior prom, my junior prom at St. Mary's. And then a couple months later was his senior prom at Don Bosco. And and then we continued to see each other and talk. But one of the difficulties in communicating with each other, as you can imagine, we had party lines on the telephone. if you picked up the phone, sometimes you would hear other people talking. And so you'd have to quietly put the receiver down and wait a while before you could try again, and see if they were still on the line. And you had to share that line with people you didn't know. And then we would want to be talking for quite some time, and then you'd hear someone else pick up the phone. And so you'd have to cut it short because other people wanted to, and they were phones that were on the wall, and rotary phones. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think technology is so hard for people my age, because we didn't grow up with that. You guys have had it since, I sometimes ask my 5-year-old grandson to help me with something I can't figure out on my iPad or my phone. But yeah, it was different.
All right, well, I think now is as good a time as any to take 5. So
Okay.
Catch your breath.
All right, thank you.
All right, we are back. All right, so let's see here. So the space race and, events like, the launching of the Sputnik, other things like the Red Scare, like that obviously those were signs of, communism and Russia being like a very clear and present danger to the people of America. And like, a lot of people thought of them as like, enemies. So can you tell us, so can you just tell us, like what that was like, back in the 50s, like, kind of seeing an entire country as like, your sworn enemies, that kind of thing?
Sure. Well, and when I was born, World War II was almost finished. I had an aunt that was an army nurse, and she was stationed in Japan. And I remember waiting, my family waiting, not so much me, but waiting for letters from her to make sure she was still okay. And we recently found one of her letters from 1945 that described what the camps were like and what their accommodations were like. It's so interesting to read back and see what that was like, because then it was the Japanese at that point. Well, go forward a little bit, and then, like you said, it was Russia, and you hated communism, you hated Russians, you didn't know any of them personally, but as a group, it was a scary time. There was, under Kennedy's auspices, there was that Bay of Pigs where Russia had placed some weaponry in Cuba, which, was right across the water from us. And you were frightened, but not immediate frightening. I mean, it wasn't like it was going to happen tomorrow. So, and you didn't hear a lot about it. It certainly wasn't immediate information about it. But nobody wanted anything to do with communism in those days. We were kind of a nation united against the Russians. And it was a little disappointing when the Russians put the first spaceship into orbit. But the country was, it appeared to me at least, the country was so energized by a space program that, and it felt competitive with the Russians. So, you hung on anything you could hear or read about the space program. And in fact, I was glad that we did this interview, because it made me bring out this book that I was telling the boys the other day, that Walter Cronkite was one of the contributors to this. And the title of the book is "We Interrupt This Broadcast." And so it relived the events that kind of stopped our lives along the way. from the Hindenburg. And this book goes all the way to Princess Diana being killed. It brings back some of those memories that you kind of lock away at my age and don't remember. It just revives our memory. So yeah, it felt like the space program brought us together as a country again. So, and I don't remember a lot about the individual things, but I remember whenever we could, we would be watching the events on TV when they were, being broadcast, which wasn't very often.
So yeah, just elaborating on that a bit further, like it was a very unifying, force, against Russia and all that. Like, did you or, your family, was there any real fear of like, nuclear war? Like, did you ever deal with like duck and cover drills in school? Anything of that?
Yeah, I think we did. I think we focused more on weather problems than on duck and cover kind of things from nuclear war. More, tornado drills and fire drills, that kind of thing. I don't think that, at least as far as I remember, and it might have been, my circumstance in life, but I don't remember being so fearful of it. In fact, today I'm more fearful of what's going on in the world than I was back in those days. And maybe it was because I was younger, but in fact, when you talk about fear, one of the things that happened in 1963, and I was in college in 63, was the Kennedy assassination. And I can remember clearly walking through the hall, going to the music room, and somebody in passing said, "Did you happen to hear about Kennedy?" And I was like, "No, what?" We didn't have phones that gave us information. You didn't, unless you had the radio on, you wouldn't even hear about it. And I can remember thinking to myself, okay, it's another one of those jokes. Why are they making jokes about something like that? Only to find out that it was true, and how everything stopped. Classes were not held. It was a surreal time in that, how could one of our presidents be killed? Even though we knew, historically we knew about Lincoln and all of that, but not in our day and age. And so I think, I certainly remember crying. I think that classes were canceled for a couple of days while we, listened and watched, and because everybody had a radio, even if they didn't have a TV. And by 1962, many people had TVs. But I remember thinking to myself, my gosh, everything stood still. In an instant, the life of the world could change. And when you think about 9/11 and that happening, it was similar in that I was working at that point at Sacred Heart. I was at the St. Mary's campus, and I can remember everything stopping and everybody running to a TV to see what was happening. And there was sadness. But in that case, when the world stopped, or at least our country stopped, there was more fear. When Kennedy was shot, it felt far away, and you personally were invested in him as a person and as president, and so you were sad, but there wasn't that fear of your life like there was on 9/11, because you didn't know if that was the only event, or were there going to be multiple places throughout the country where there would be more bombings, more disruption. And there were the plane that went down, the Pentagon, that kind of thing. But it was more of a fearful time than it was about Russia, to be honest, I think. Yeah.
All right.
And so we're on the topic of the 60s, the civil rights movement, that was
Oh,
very
yeah.
big. And
Yes,
it was a big issue, kind of like the Black Lives Matter movement is right now. And,
absolutely.
can
Well,
you
and
tell us about like any personal experiences you may have had with it?
well, we always
I'm
lived on
sorry,
this.
I'm sorry. Just let me like elaborate. So like, how did you feel personally about the cause? Like, people like John Lewis, MLK, how did you feel about them? And did you agree with the cause? Like that kind of thing? Like sit-ins, freedom rides, that kind of thing?
Well, I never participated. I'll be real honest. I never participated in any of them. We lived on the south side of Milwaukee my whole life, and you did not cross the viaduct. You just didn't. You were separate. And my experience with people of color, very limited. I had no friends that were Black until I went to work. And when I was in high school and college, I don't even remember unless maybe there were a sister, a nun or two in my class that were of color. I had very limited experience. As a student, my nursing experiences were all at hospitals on the south side of Milwaukee. I remember thinking how unfair it was that people were treated differently. And Margaret Rosca, who ended up being the wife of Father Groppi, who had left the priesthood and then married her, was a classmate of mine in college. And it surprised me when I would see her involved in these because she was very quiet, as I recall, and very soft-spoken, but she was right at the front. And I remember admiring her for having that as a cause. And I can remember reading something that said, because she became poet laureate of Milwaukee, I remember reading something that said that she expected that all of the civil unrest would be over by the end of summer. And here we are today, how many years later, 50 some years later, and we're still struggling with that. My family was somewhat divided. My oldest aunt was very biased. My second oldest aunt wasn't, because she had been in the army and was in Japan and had exposure to a number of different cultures and people, and the youngest one too was not. I'm sure deep-seated bias is there, and in fact, when people say, "Well, I'm not racist," I think of myself. I pray that I don't ever express any of it, but I know somewhere deep inside, I grew up in that environment. And although I felt like I had a good and happy childhood and upbringing, I know that I have some of those feelings deep inside. And like I said, I pray that as I learn more about people and know people as people, that those feelings are gone. But I remember being frightened because you didn't know what to expect from people who were Black. And when I think about how sad that was, and so I'm so glad that people, when I worked at Sacred Heart, there was a young girl who, and can you cut some of this out if it doesn't fit our agenda here, but I remember I loved her, and she was Black, but she's quite a bit younger than I. And Sacred Heart would go to one of the fests at the lakefront, the Italian fest, and we were volunteers, and we're giving out newspapers, and it was hotter than heck that day. And so I didn't realize it, but our hands were covered with newsprint. And when I would go to wipe my face or try to get rid of the sweat that was pouring down, I was putting that print on my face. And so she and I were going to meet at a certain time. And as we were walking toward each other, all of a sudden she looked at me and she held her arms out and she said, "Mom," because I had a black face at that point. And we remembered that the whole time. Over the years, we still talk about her being my daughter. But you know, I worry that I still have some of those biases, and I can't even point them out because I hope I've repressed them. But you know that when you grew up that way, it's tough to get rid of it.
Yeah,
So,
that's understandable. I can see, like, growing up in a, you know, predominantly Polish, you know, Catholic
Yeah.
neighborhood, like that definitely, you know, gives you a little bit of bias.
well,
You know, people
certainly, because
one type
you
of-
had no exposure to people of different cultures. So, yeah.
So
Yeah, that must-
yeah, sorry, no, just real quick, like, do you remember, like, you know, watching on the news the events going on in Birmingham or Selma, like the March on Selma or the Birmingham protests?
Sure, but you know, I'll tell you, I think we watched it with a biased eye and couldn't understand why people would do that. Why would they kind of try to upset the apple cart? You know, I was high school and college. In college, of course, my views and my opinions broadened, but again, very limited. You know, in college, mostly white students, and all women again. I can remember those events. I can remember really admiring Martin Luther King and his words, because his words were always about love and getting along and gentleness and kindness, and I loved his speeches. But the actual marches, I just didn't quite understand them. Today, of course, I do, but not then. And I remember paying attention to it when I was in college. High school, not so much. But
So you said like you were very accepting of what Martin Luther King said, and like you just liked his message a lot.
very much so, very much so. I loved his words. I liked his approach to, you know, the issues. But obviously, that approach didn't get the changes that were needed as quickly as they were needed. And so I'm not fond of Black Lives Matter, only because I believe all lives matter. And I don't agree with the looting and the destruction, but I understand where it's coming from. I mean, the actions I can never condone, but the principles that are trying to be achieved definitely need to be. We have to do something. Milwaukee is still as biased as it always was, segregating groups of people, and so things need to happen more quickly. But I always loved his message, and I reread his I Have a Dream often, because it speaks to what should be the essence of what changes we want to make.
So going back to that question, do you think he was like able to reach both sides? Like he was that one figure that was really able to kind of be everywhere at once, like beyond with the whites, the blacks, everyone else, and he can just kind of just everyone understood.
I think so, but I always think, you know, the people who, when I was in high school and college, that were older, it was harder for them to even listen to his message. So you had groups of people who didn't listen to him and didn't appreciate his message only because he was Black. And the racism was so ingrained in them. And in fact, I have this old story of my oldest aunt who worked at a clothing manufacturing company. She did sewing, and in those days you did piecework. So you got paid by the number of pieces that you sewed. And I can remember her saying to my sister something about not liking that black one. And my sister said, really? She said, that surprises me. She said, what about, there was an African-American woman that worked with my aunt, and she was Bessie the Presser. She would press the clothing after they would sew it. And my sister said to her, well, what about Bessie the Presser? And she said, well, she's not black, she's Bessie the Presser. And so that was a lesson that I've carried with me. When you know the person, the color doesn't matter ever. But it's that group of people that when you harbor that racism, the group of people is what you have an issue with. But if you knew them individually, it wouldn't be that way. So I think there were people who didn't listen to his message. But I do think that he spanned more than many political and public figures who were speaking there, because he did have a better message. I liken it almost to Jesus's message, where things have to change, but love has to be part of that equation as well. So, oh boy, I went on and on, didn't I? I'm sorry.
That's good.
All right.
He was like, the message was very much like, would you agree, like Gandhi? Just
yes, yes. But Martin Luther King also said love and peace, but there has to be change. You know, but he said it in a way that appealed to more people, maybe not all people, but more people, I believe. Yeah.
All right. So next question. So obviously another thing that was, you know, very, very present in 60s America was, you know, the Vietnam War. And obviously you had people on the side of, you know, I don't want to support this, we have no reason to fight it. And you have other people saying, like, you know, if we let this fall, then, you know, they could be on our doorstep, you know, shortly. So can you just tell us, like, you know, back then, like, what was, you know, your whole take on Vietnam? Like, were you for it or against it? Like, how did people around you feel about it? Like, what did you think when you saw stuff about it on the news, that kind of thing?
You know, what's interesting about that is and boy, I'm bearing my soul to you guys today. I was oblivious to the faction that was against people being there.
So I'm sorry, it was like you were for?
No, I was just going to say that I wasn't for or against it, but our country was in there fighting. And so I was supporting our country, I believe. I didn't know that there were people who expressed hatred to the soldiers coming back from there until I was somewhat older and kept hearing about how people were against this war. At the time, because our country believed it was important to do, again, here I am, you know, the follow the rules, follow, you know, I just supported it because our country did. And I didn't have a stand other than, yes, we're there and we need to fight, and we need to fight for those most vulnerable, which I felt like the people they were fighting for. And I supported the soldiers, the individual soldiers who came home after fighting in the war, and just never even realized that there were people who felt strongly about not being there. Now, having said that, I did hear about people who defected to Canada so they could avoid having to go. People who, you know, found reasons why, medical reasons or whatever, so that they didn't have to go and fight. But I didn't realize the magnitude of the people who were against at all the United States being in that war. Yeah.
Well, on that topic, and I'm very glad you mentioned that, was so you and Richard were in your 20s around that time, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So was there any, plan for what to do if Richard got drafted? Was there any real concern about that?
He was in the army. He enlisted in the army. Excuse me, after college, but he was stationed only in the United States. So he was at Fort Myer and I'd have to go back and look. But he was in the army for, I don't know, maybe about 4 years, and then was in the reserves for a while. He just felt it was his duty. And so maybe that, now that you mention that, maybe that's why I supported the country's position on Vietnam, because my husband joined the army and, was supportive of what the army's position was. I'm not saying it was easy. I mean, he, worked hard and it was tough, but that was before we got married that he was in the army. Yeah. So he must have been in like in 66, 67, and about 4 years. And then in, like I say, in the reserves. So, yeah.
Okay. And again, that leads us into, my next question. Like, can you just describe, married life with Richard, like initially, like, after you guys got married in 67?
67. Yep, we did. We lived above his grandmother, Josephine Stawicki. It was a flat, upstairs and downstairs. And we lived there for a couple of years until our oldest son was 2. And then we moved to another family home on 80th and Euclid. And in fact, your grandma and grandpa lived in that house before we did on 80th and Euclid. And I wasn't working after Joe was born. And I was out of nursing for maybe about 8 years or so. And we initially rented out, it was another duplex, and we rented out the upstairs, we were downstairs. And I wanted to get back into nursing because I had only done like 2 years worth of public health nursing. And technology had made such strides in those 7 years, that I went to St. Luke's and came home in tears, because they said, because of technology, I'd have to do a month's full-time days orientation, a month of full-time PMs orientation, and I wanted 3 evenings a week, so that, I mean, daycare was almost non-existent at that time, and we probably wouldn't even have considered it. So I wanted something that he could be at work. He was an accountant, come home, and I would leave and go to work. And so that's why I ended up at Sacred Heart, because when I called to see about it, they were very welcoming. In fact, the director of nursing said, we'll send a car to pick you up. And so my return to work was one that fit in with our family life, so that we never had to have, any kind of babysitters or anything, because I'd leave and I would leave when he came home. And so that worked. I often say, I ended up in administration at Columbia St. Mary's. And I often said, those kind of accommodations breed loyalty. I was with Sacred Heart and then with Columbia St. Mary's for over 30 years. But, every family's situation is different. And so, we were able to accommodate work and home life very well, just because of where I chose to work. So.
All right. Jack, do you have anything you want to ask?
Not really.
Well, if that's the case, then I think that we are pretty much done here. Again, thank you. Auntie Eileen, for doing this for us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, you've
Can I
been
just say something? When you first asked me about this experience, I was like, oh gosh, okay, sure, I'll do it because it's Barrett. And then when the information came and it was all of the things that had to be done, I was like, oh my gosh, what did I sign up for? This was probably one of the best experiences that I've had in a long time. Number one, it's the two of you who are so bright and so kind and so thoughtful and are so good at listening to my concerns. I kept telling Barrett, I don't want to let you guys down. I'm nervous about doing this. And I've never been nervous about speaking in public. So this was a new experience. But it also brought back so many memories that I'm honored to do this and I appreciate it. And you guys are terrific. So thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Of course.
All right. Thank you guys.
You are one of many stories of the, city of Milwaukee that'll be preserved for, many generations.
Well, God bless you guys as you go on. And I'm sure I'll hear stories of Barrett, but I'll be asking about you, Jack, too. So thank you. All right. Bye-bye, guys.
Yeah.
All right.